Before you left to find yourself, you sent a postcard. Before the greatest band in history fell apart, there was a boy in a hospital bed in Liverpool who had no idea what was coming. Richard Starkey, the boy the world would one day call Ringo Starr, was 6 years old when his body nearly killed him. Peritonitis, a vicious infection, landed him in a hospital for an entire year. Not a week. Not a month. A full year. While other kids were learning to read, write, and make friends, Ringo was staring at ceiling tiles. That year didn't just cost him school. It cost him something harder to get back, the quiet confidence that grows when a child feels normal. But here's where it gets darker. 7 years later, just as he was trying to catch up, tuberculosis hit. 2 more years gone. 2 more years in isolation, this time during adolescence, the exact window when you figure out who you are, where you fit, whether you matter. Ringo missed all of it. And that absence carved something permanent into him. A voice that never quite went quiet, whispering that he was behind. That he was broken. That he didn't really belong. He carried that voice into the most famous band in history. When Ringo joined the Beatles in 1962, he wasn't walking into a dream. He was a deeply insecure young man stepping onto a stage beside 3 of the greatest songwriters who ever lived. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison. Genius on every side. And every single day, that old whisper got louder. Is this good enough? Do they see it? Do they know I'm the weak one? And then, one by one, his bandmates gave that whisper something to work with. George Harrison was the first to pull away. Already bitter about his own songs being sidelined, George didn't reach out to Ringo in shared frustration. He went cold. Distant. And then came the moment that said everything without a word. George brought in Eric Clapton to play guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. One of the greatest guitarists alive, brought into the studio without even asking Ringo. The message landed like a punch. Your presence here is optional. Then came John, the one Ringo trusted most. When Yoko Ono became John's constant companion in 1968, she began openly criticizing Ringo's drumming in front of everyone. And John said nothing. He didn't defend him. He didn't push back. He just let it happen. For a man who'd spent his whole life waiting to be told he wasn't good enough, that silence was deafening. But the deepest wound came from Paul McCartney. By 1968, Paul's grip on the studio had become absolute. He didn't just have opinions, he took over. And during the White Album sessions, Ringo hit his limit. He felt unseen, undervalued, and in his own words, unloved and out of it. On August 22nd, 1968, he quit. Not for an afternoon. For 2 weeks. He flew to Spain while the Beatles' future hung in the air. What happened while he was gone made it worse. Paul stepped in and played drums himself on several tracks, including Back in the USSR. For Ringo, hearing his own bandmate replace him on his own instrument sent one unmistakable message. We don't need you. You're replaceable. He came back. They apologized. But some damage doesn't wash off. Now here's what most people miss entirely. Because while all of that was painful, it wasn't the deepest betrayal. The deepest betrayal came from the outside. When Brian Epstein died in 1967, he left behind a void that nobody could really fill. Brian had been their protector, the man who understood both the business and the human beings inside it. His death left the Beatles grieving and exposed. And into that gap walked Alan Klein. Klein was a financial manager who had previously handled the Rolling Stones. And here's something the Beatles were warned about before they ever shook his hand. The Stones tried to tell them. Mick Jagger reportedly said, "Don't trust this man. He took from us. He'll take from you." But the Beatles were desperate for structure. Klein was persuasive. And desperation makes people sign things they shouldn't. What happened next wasn't just mismanagement. It was something more calculated. Klein walked into a room full of fractures and studied every single one. He saw Paul's hunger for control. He saw John's emotional volatility. He saw George's simmering resentment. And he saw Ringo, a peace-seeking man who would do almost anything to stop the fighting, who just wanted everyone to get along. Klein understood that Ringo's greatest quality, his instinct for harmony, was also his greatest vulnerability. And he used it. He told Paul one thing and the other 3 something else entirely. He built alliances and then quietly dismantled them. He pushed decisions through by isolating members from the process. He encouraged the others to move forward without Paul's signature. He used the band's internal pain as leverage, trading their division for his own financial gain. While they were fighting each other, their money was disappearing. And every time Klein needed Ringo's support, he knew exactly what to say. We need to move forward. We need to be on the same page. And Ringo, the man who just wanted peace, would agree, not realizing he was signing away his own interests to preserve a harmony that Klein was quietly destroying from the inside. By March 1970, John, George, and Ringo fired him. Klein was terminated, investigated, and his reputation in the music industry collapsed. But it was already too late. George Harrison later described the financial situation as disastrous, saying the company had been picked apart by what he called all these famous gangsters. Paul was suing the other three Beatles. There was no trust left. No table where they could all sit down together. Klein hadn't just mismanaged their money. He had poisoned the one thing that could have survived everything else, the brotherhood. Because here's the hard truth about the Beatles' collapse. Creative partnerships can survive arguments. They can survive criticism, competition, even betrayal by people inside the circle. What they cannot survive is an outsider who arrives at the exact moment of grief and vulnerability, who maps every fracture, and then deliberately widens each one. Ringo had already survived things that should have broken him: illness, isolation, years stolen from him before he was old enough to understand what was happening. He had clawed his way into the greatest band in history and held his place there. He had proven the whisper wrong. And then Alan Klein arrived. Not swinging, not shouting, but smiling, selling, promising, and quietly dismantling everything Ringo had worked so hard to build. The Beatles played their last public performance on a London rooftop in January 1969. Cold afternoon. 5 cameras. Passers-by stopping on the street below, craning their necks, not quite believing what they were hearing. It was extraordinary. And it was the end. The music they made together changed the world. That part is permanent. Nobody can take that away. But the cost, the broken trust, the legal battles, the years of estrangement, was enormous. And for Ringo Starr, the man who had spent his whole life afraid he didn't belong, the collapse of the Beatles wasn't just a professional loss. It was the confirmation of every fear he'd ever had. He had finally found his place. And then someone came along who knew exactly how to take it from him.